Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Our guest today is Judd Devermont, unquestionably one of the U.S.'s leading policy practitioners and experts on Africa. His experience ranges from the White House to the CIA and many points in between. Since leaving government in 2024, Judd has been an operating partner at Kupanda Capital. He previously served as Special Assistant to President Biden and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. In this role, he was responsible for coordinating U.S. policy toward the continent. Judd was also the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and previous to that, he was the National Intelligence Council's National Intelligence Officer for Africa. Judd began his career and served for over a decade as a senior political analyst at the CIA with a focus on Africa. I'm very pleased to welcome Judd Devermont to Earlylands in Conversation. Judd, thank you very much for joining us today. We're probably finding you in DC, is that right?
That's right. I'm happy to be here, Todd. Thanks.
So DC in July, I presume it's lovely weather and cool and
So oppressive, so painful. But you know what? That's DC. It's the extremes: hot weather, cold weather,
yeah,
good times, bad.
weather and policy extremes, right?
Yes,
There's never a
exactly.
middle ground.
No.
So let's jump right into this. I mean, you and I, we were just chatting for 15 minutes before, and I realized I had to hit record. Otherwise, all the the good gossip is going to go unrecorded. So let's jump right into this, my friend. Um, you know, I hate to open by saying something like, boy, these are super busy times in Africa. That's the very definition of reductionist. But I do feel like that when you look across the continent right now, there's so much going on and so much that's actually escaping the headlines. I'm thinking about rising political instability in Kenya, ever faltering ANC in South Africa, rising Islamic extremism in the Sahel, and Sudan, of course. I'm going to ask you to do the impossible and give us a narrative lens through which to kind of think about Africa today. And I'm wondering if it's something like the old order buckling under the pressure of youth or technology, or maybe that's just too pithy, or is it just too much to try to find any pattern across 54 very distinct countries? What's a lens through which we can think about Africa today?
Well, it's almost a fool's errand, right? To try to,
Right,
to come up
right.
with a single story, a single narrative, a single lens, given how diverse this continent is, how vast it is, how populous it is, and each of these countries have their own histories and trajectories. But I'll share with you two ways that I have been thinking about the continent. One starts with a personal story. I was, President Biden's senior director for Africa, um, and I was at my desk. It was August of 2023. There had just been a coup in Gabon. There had been a coup in Niger the month prior, and then in April of that year, the civil war broke out, and I kind of had my head in my hands and thinking about, what is happening on the continent, and then with some reflection, I try to think about, well, when has this moment happened in the past? Or when have we had a similar period or perhaps a worse period of tumult and instability? And I went quickly to the 1990s. For your American audience, that maybe sound like a time that it was triumphant, right? Berlin Wall falls down, end of the Soviet Union, end of history, the America unipolar moment. But for Africa, it's mixed as best, right? You get the end of apartheid and you get Namibian independence and multi-party democracy introduced in not just Benin and Ghana, but even like Central African Republic and Burundi. But at the same time, it was a pretty difficult, disordered moment on the continent with Black Hawk Down and the Rwandan genocide, the Congo wars, the intensification of Angola's civil war, conflict in Liberia and Sierra Leone. And what was really happening at that moment was that you saw the end of the order, the international system that had really been in place since 1945. And that meant that the US was pulling out, not supporting its allies. The Soviet Union was pulling out, not supporting its clients. The IMF was coming in and saying, you're going to have all this austerity measures. And it really punched the continent upside the head. You saw governments fall, you saw civil war, you saw conflict. And really in this period where an old system had departed and a new system was not yet formed, there was great instability in the continent. It took a number of years before there was stabilization, new norms, new consensus, new ways of behaving. And you could think about that experience and then go back to 2023 when I'm at my desk and a similar parallel, right? We are in the midst of a changing world order. The way the Biden administration talked about it was that we're in a competition over what is next. And I think because of that, where there's no longer a consensus, we no longer have agreed upon ways in which we interact with each other, new parties and players coming into the continent, others leaving. It's allowed for a lot of external manipulation and some internal mischief. Um, and so you're seeing just an incredible amount of volatility, right? Global disorder affects the continent really negatively. So that's one way that I think about it. But the second way, because that's really an outside in, the inside out way I think about it is that, and it's not wholly unrelated, is that after 30 years of a particular set of conventional and received wisdoms, there's a huge amount of questioning on the continent. So, not only questioning the international order and questioning the fairness of the international financial system, questioning whether there's an inclusive enough system at the UN and other places, but closer to home, questioning the incumbents, questioning the ANC after 30 years, questioning the rule of the Botswana ruling party that had been there since 1968 and just lost its first election, and then questioning uh, post-colonial powers, questioning the French, questioning the United States, questioning France, and questioning even democracy. According to polling, 50% of Africans believe that it's okay to overthrow a government if you disagree with the way that they are ruling. And so that's how I think about this moment. It explains what's happening in Kenya. It explains what's happening um, in South Africa, is that after 30 years, you have a global international order that is starting to crumble, and you have Africans on the continent asking questions, really serious, important questions about what should be the way that we organize ourselves and what is the best way for our to interact with our leaders, to interact with each other. And you're going to get some really interesting and innovation out of that. You're going to see some moments like in Senegal, and you're going to see some pretty heartbreaking conflict and volatility. And that's kind of where we are. And I think we'll be there for a little while until sort of a new stasis emerges and a new way of interacting comes out.
Well, I like that phrase for you say the Biden administration about, the battle over what comes next.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the most appropriate thing that I've heard. And I should say, in even saying, give me a narrative lens which to think about Africa, just because, I mean, there's war in Ukraine, obviously, but that does not indicate that there will be war in Italy. But, we would say the same thing that, well, there's war in Sudan. And oftentimes you'll see, well, what does that mean for Kenya? What does
Yeah.
that mean for Tanzania? And it's hundreds and hundreds of miles of distance, right? But we're far too often just willing to group Africa into one big lump.
Well, this is
And
a sort of an occupational hazard, is that those
indeed,
of us who work on Africa are asked to speak about trends and dynamics across 54 countries, which is impossible and an unfair task. So I try to do meta, and then I also try to do, more micro or
sure,
macro.
indeed. Let's think about that. So, I mean, you're a seasoned Africa expert. You've been doing this for 25 plus years. And it probably takes a lot to move the needle for you in terms of prompting you to think, hey, this is new or interesting. But what trends or issues on the continent right now are you most intrigued by?
This is one that I've written about before a couple years ago, and it is never ceasing to interest me and intrigue me, which is that Africa is integrating in the global community at a rate and with a reach that I think is unprecedented, and it's really exciting. It offers a lot of opportunity. It says a lot about the continent's important. It says a lot about how African leaders are thinking about their position in the world. It also comes with some risks. It actually quite dovetails with what I just said, right, about a changing international order. But when you ask someone about Africa's external partners, almost certainly they are going to say the former colonial powers. They'll say US, they'll say China, they'll say a resurgent Russia, maybe they'll say the Gulf states and Turkey, but it is so much more than that. And this is just, Todd, in the last 6 weeks, I'm just going to run down some things that have happened.
Sure.
Prime Minister Modi of India went to Ghana and Namibia. The Ukrainians, which have opened like 8 new embassies in the last couple of
Yeah,
years,
it's crazy how fast they're expanded.
crazy, right? They're training the Mauritanians, right? Military. They're training the Mauritanian military. There was a huge Vietnamese delegation that just came to Cote d'Ivoire. Rwanda just had an official visit to Kazakhstan. So when you think about it, like, these aren't the relationships that you generally come to, and the reasons there's push and pull, right? For the Africans, it is in their interest to have relationships with countries beyond the sort of the big powers or even the middle powers. There's, uh, strategic depth there, but there's also things that these other countries can provide, insights, specialization, trade relationships that others can't. For example, Estonia is really big on e-government services. It's
Yeah,
one of
I followed. We do a lot of sort of Baltic work, and it's amazing how much the Baltics
yeah,
care about Africa
yeah.
and genuinely are putting time and effort and money into Africa. But yeah, you're saying, sorry to interrupt, but about
No,
Estonia,
no,
I've always thought that's
it's a good
fascinating.
example, right? So Estonia, you would not think that Estonia has much of a foreign policy towards the continent. And so that's what's driving, I think, African outreach. But for the rest of the world, they see the opportunities on the continent.
Right,
They see that there's trade opportunities. They also see Africa's growing strategic importance and its political power globally. So Serbia and Kosovo are spending a lot of time on the continent trying to win
right.
recognition of Kosovo or retract recognition of Kosovo. So I think that understanding and seeing these different relationships that are budding or deepening is really exciting. And there's a lot of opportunity there. There's challenges, right? Those countries bring their own politics in. If you're going to have a deepening relationship with Israel, there's going to be, other consequences of it. You can see it with the Gulf state rivalries. You can see it with Turkey. But I think on balance, it's very exciting. And when I was in government, it was something that I wanted to do. How do we reach out to Central European countries that are interested in Africa or work with the Japanese or the Indians? We didn't get as far as I would like, but I think there's a lot of potential there.
Let's move on a little bit, and we have to make the inevitable foray into Africa and the Trump administration.
I knew it was coming.
Yeah, I know it's got to come. It's got to come. Uh, Take my first question and put it into the context of the Trump administration. What's the narrative lens that we should use when thinking about the administration's engagement with Africa, which has not been inconsequential so far, right? We've seen quite a few headlines coming out of the DRC. We just had a quite interesting group of lunch guests at the White House. So tell us how to think about that.
Yeah, I do think you can marry those first comments I made about global disorder and African questioning to understand the Trump Africa policy. And I want to be clear, like, I don't think that Trump is the cause per se of global disorder or African questioning, but I think he is a response to it. And I think he's an accelerant. And what has happened when you look at the Trump policy, and it's not coherent at all. In fact, I would make an argument that there's a bunch of different things that are happening. They're sort of in silos, and they're not um, working hand in glove with each other. Actually, they're in tension with each other, right? They don't all add up. But here's a framework that I think about. There's a series of global policies that the Trump administration has that hurt Africa, maybe disproportionately, but certainly hurt Africa, right? So the dismantling of USAID,
Right.
tariffs, particularly in Southern Africa, the visa bans, which is a couple of African countries now, but could be almost the entire continent, up to
Sure.
35, 36 countries, these sort of deportation deals that are happening. I don't think any of those are really about Africa, but they affect Africa, right? So it's a global policy that affects Africa. And, different parts of the White House are driving those. Then there's a bunch of, I would call them actually bipartisan policies that have a Trump flair to them, right? A Trump spin,
Right.
a Trump, je ne sais quoi to them that makes them more extreme than they would be in a regular Republican or traditional Republican or Democratic administration. So that's the DRC Rwanda deal. So that was a deal that we worked on in the Biden administration, led by Avril Haines, who was the DNI. A lot of the elements were there. It was handed off to the Trump administration. We're very lucky, I believe, that Trump has spent so much time talking about it, engaging on it, and has helped move it forward. You can talk about this rhetoric around trade, not aid. I mean, no administration has ever said aid, not trade. I mean,
Right. Indeed.
you know, that has been something that every administration has wanted um, to do and has launched initiatives for. But it's very much seen in this Trump transactional sort of vision. You could look at terrorism. Um, the Trump administration is doing a lot of strikes in Somalia. And when I say a lot of strikes in Somalia, I have the numbers for you. As of this recording, they've done 52 strikes in this administration.
Wow.
That is more than Obama in his entirety of his term. If you look at 2019, if you look at his first term, he did 219 strikes. That's more than Obama or Biden and Bush all combined. But again, strikes are not unique to any administration. He's just doing it. They're just doing it in an extreme and with a lot of velocity and a lot of volume. So
Right.
a bunch of policies that are historic, bipartisan with a Trump flair. And then finally, there's one policy that you can see is emanating directly from the president, which is South Africa. So I look at these different policies and I'm like, and I try to pick between them to try to understand what is happening. And ultimately, all of them don't add up, right? Like they work at cross purposes. Some of them are positive. Some of them I strenuously, with everything in my body, oppose and
Sure.
deplore. But it's a mishmash, and I think it's been very difficult for Africans to try to pursue some of the things they're interested in. At the same time, there's a number of things that are really to their detriment. So it's a very confusing time, and a challenging time, which is why there is, again, to the earlier narrative, it's part of the global disorder and it's part of this African questioning about who should their partners be.
So that's a great segue into the question of, the transactionalism of the Trump administration. How much are we really ceding ground for US interest in Africa to China, India, Gulf states, Turkey, even Russia? Or is everyone still just trying to figure out exactly what the US is doing and is not truly capitalizing on this shift to a deeply transactional US foreign policy towards Africa?
Well, I'm not sure that it's transactionalism that is why ground is being potentially ceded uh, to China or others, right? Like if you look at some of the polling, it's really interesting. So for the first time, Afrobarometer has said that China is more popular than the United States in
Right,
Africa.
right.
It's always been neck and neck, and that results came out, this year, so it reflects previous years. Same with some of the Pew polling that came out in 2024. So I think it's a longer trend, to be sure. By the way, I always like to say this. It's always important to say this, even though African support for the U.S. is declining, it is still the one region in the world where the U.S. is the most popular. So we just have to keep both of those ideas in our head. But I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why we're seeing that. There's other players, where we haven't had the kind of innovative programming that we had under President Bush in a long time. A lot of the stuff has been small ball. And so that's on the transactional, or at least, or what does it mean for seeding the ground? But I thought I'd actually just kind of push back on the transactional point, because that's what we all expect him to be, right? That's what Africans may actually want, or some Africans, but it's not clear that he really is transactional. I mean, South Africa, I don't know what the transaction is that he's asking for the South Africans, with this falsehood about white genocide. When I talk to African ambassadors who are trying to negotiate tariffs, they don't know what to negotiate. What is there to trade to get the tariff down? So what I think Trump is actually motivated by is, yes, deals and transactions, but also ideology in some cases. And the question that I have, which gets back to questioning, which gets back to US support in Africa, is how many times are African leaders going to come to the Oval Office, are going to try to make a deal, and they don't get anything for it? I mean, that's something to watch, right? I think everyone's going to give it a good college try, but what did the five leaders get when they came to the Oval? They got to be in the Oval. That's always attractive, but they got asked to take deportees. They said they weren't going to get tariffs, but none of those countries had tariffs above 10% anyway. And you're starting to see some of this patience wearing thin already. The AU Commission Chair, Youssef, who was a former Djibouti foreign minister,
Right.
had some pretty harsh words at the Corporate Council on Africa event in Luanda about the visa sanction, the visa bans, etc. President Mahama of Ghana had a statement about how Ramaphosa was treated in the Oval Office. So you're starting to see a little bit of, one, what are we getting for the transactions? And two, how do we marry all of the things that you're saying and doing with USAID, which I think is one of the reasons why we will continue to slip on the continent, with everything else that's going on. So it's going to be an interesting sort of look back to say, he says he's transactional. Was he really as transactional as we
Right.
thought?
That's a good way to put it, right? I mean, transactionalism. I mean, Trump advertises that as his brand,
Yes.
and so it's probably intellectually lazy for me to use that, right? And
I don't think it's
um,
intellectually lazy. I think it's super constructive to try to think about, this is what he says. This is how Africans are coming to DC with that idea. And is it true? I'll just give you one more example. There's a lot of talk about the Congo Rwanda deal and minerals and how minerals played into it. But I don't believe that, listen, there's a number of a number of American companies that are getting deals in the Congo. But I don't believe that that's what unlocked anything for this peace deal, right? The Congolese and the Rwandans for many years have said we want Americans to invest in our mining sector. So what was the transaction? There was already a willing sellers on the African side. Now, did that maybe entice Trump to get more involved? Perhaps, but it's not straight transactionalism, and it was built on a much more comprehensive security and economic and political deal than just mines for peace.
great way to put it, exactly. All right, so before we transition into some of the very interesting historical work you've been doing recently, I'm going to ask you to put on your NIO hat. So, for those who don't know, the National Intelligence Officer, or NIO, is a pretty key role in the intelligence community. And Judd was the NIO for Africa. And so, this job involves, and there's one for most, I think, every region of the world,
Yep.
but involves looking at long term trends in Africa and providing quote unquote warning around issues that could affect the US. What issues keep you up at night, or, the current NIO? What do you think is keeping them up at night regarding the continent?
Well, I think there's probably two conflict zones, and then something more thematic, which we've been touching on throughout this conversation. On regions, the Sahel,
Right, of
sure,
course.
right? So it's the epicenter of terrorism right now globally. Many of these countries are overrun by extremist groups. Extremist groups probably control 50 to 60% of Burkina Faso, for example. It's an interesting place where you can see how poor governance opens the door for extremism, how extremism opens the door for Russia to come in and provide security services, and how the failure of both of those things have led to coups. And so you have
Right.
a coup in Burkina, you have a coup in Niger, you have a coup in Mali. Actually, Burkina and Mali have had two coups, 2020, and they're quite popular. And so I think in the Sahel, while it doesn't threaten the US homeland per se, I do think that it is bringing down the entire region. Um, Blotting out much of it, creating openings for adversaries, and with a real threat that it will spread further south into Ghana, into Cote d'Ivoire, into Benin, into Togo, affecting the sort of the Atlantic coast communities and the Atlantic Ocean countries, which includes us. So the Sahel is one of them. The second is in East Africa. We've already talked about the civil war in Sudan. While in Ethiopia, the conflict in northern Tigray, in northern Ethiopia in Tigray has been solved, or at least there's been a ceasefire, a very tenuous one. There's still conflict in Amhara, in Oromia. There's tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea, including very harsh words recently from Eritrea. There's tension between Somalia and Ethiopia. There's some real problems in South Sudan. So in the Sahel, you see the conflict spreading and maybe
Right.
engulfing. I think the problem in East Africa, which is really some of the crossroads of the world between Europe and the Middle East and East Africa and the Indo-Pacific, you see the threat of conflicts merging. And that's been part of the history of East Africa, is different governments sponsor the rebels and dissidents of their opponents. So those are the two sort of regions that I worry about in terms of conflict getting out of control and threatening global security, threatening interests. But the one that keeps me up at night is one we've been talking about, is that I think that African governments, they're going to do their best to sort of engage this administration, but I wonder how long it's going to take before we stop being a factor to them. And I've talked to many very senior African leaders, and they've said, "You're just one of many countries now to us. With the end of USAID, with these tariffs, with the visa bans, with these sort of very superficial meetings that often people leave insulted or asked to take deportees, I do worry about the U.S. ability to influence, to engage, and to secure its interests over time if we keep going the way we are going. And that's not just a criticism of Trump. I'll tell you, Todd, that I got a lot of very angry missives coming from African partners saying, we face an existential threat here in West Africa. And what are you doing for us? You're not helping. Whereas you seem to be helping the Ukraine with their problem. So is there a double standard here? So there was already, I think, some frustration of where our rhetoric didn't meet our reality. But now there's just a panoply of different things that is really, I think, denting the US brand.
And then you have all of the sort of political crises that may probably don't elevate to the existential nature of the Sahel, but what you're seeing in Kenya, what you're seeing in South Africa, certainly enough to occupy any desk officer or NIO, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the question is, how staffed are these people with 1,000 people being left from the State Department with lots of retirements going on? Um, for the first time since the Bush 41 administration, Africa is not its own directorate at the NSC. So the job that I had, where I was the senior director for Africa, now there's a senior director for the Middle East and Africa, and that just means
Right.
less people who can at a senior level advocate for the US Africa relationship. That's not to say that the individual there isn't thinking about the US Africa relationship, but it's a much larger turf that they have now. And by the way, not every issue we're going to see the same way. So there may be disagreements about the GERD or the role of UAE, the role of Israel, and that all is now sitting in under one directorate, and that can cause some problems too. So I think it's a difficult time, and it's an understaffed bureaucracy, and with limited senior leaders who really know Africa and want to see a strong U.S. Africa relationship.
It seems like a recipe for sort of a whack-a-mole response of just trying to manage the crisis du jour as opposed to doing something more thoughtful when you've got 54 African countries plus a very tumultuous Middle East, right? Let's transition to chatting about some of the very interesting work you've been doing recently in the CIA archives, which every time you put something up on Substack or on LinkedIn, I love it because I've learned something new about region that I thought I knew a lot about. Tell us a bit about what you've been researching and the materials that you've been using in the archives.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, I'm a historian by training, and a student of U.S. Africa policy, and so I've been digging into these archives for more than 10 years. Actually, I wrote an article when I was still NIO about how the U.S. intelligence community talked about the Nigerian Civil War, and that was
Right.
published in an academic journal. And then I've been teaching a class at George Washington University for many years on the history of U.S. intelligence analysis on Africa. There's a couple of things that I've really enjoyed learning about and seeing. One is, and they're particularly relevant for this moment. One is how much the CIA covered all of the issues on the continent. It was what we
Right.
called global coverage. So making sure that even in periods of time when the administration said, we don't care about Africa, they were writing. Under LBJ, for example, under Lyndon Johnson, they reduced the amount of bilateral aid programs to just 10 countries. So only 10 countries out of, at that point, about 45 independent African countries. Only 10 were going to get development aid. And yet, I went for the archives, and this is not even complete. These are just the ones that I've gone through. There were 29 intelligence assessments on Benin, 28
Wow.
on Burundi, 26 on Sierra Leone, 12 on Congo Brazzaville. That was during LBJ's sort of term in office. There's a great story where um, uh, Kissinger goes to his PDB briefer and he says, why is there so much about Africa in the PDB? Like, the president and I are going to focus on the Soviet Union.
And the
And
PDB for those is the President's Daily Brief, sort of the president's primary product,
yes,
CIA product. Yeah.
and so Kissinger's like, why is there so much Africa? Well, I counted up how much in the Nixon Ford administration Africa stuff there was. There was more than 1,000 pieces
That's
in 8 years. So that's one thing that I thought has been so interesting. And And it's not all about the Soviets are doing X or Y. It was really a diverse set of issues, from security of regimes to trade opportunities to drug trafficking to economic integration, thinking about even like the Indo-Pacific island states. I mean, it was a really I get inspired when I read it. It doesn't mean I agree with all the assessments or think that they stand the test of time, but they were trying and successfully helping policymakers understand what was happening in this very complex, diverse continent and making the case for the US interest.
That's great. There were always good analysts sitting there churning out analysis about regions of the world that you would never think were part of U.S. policy dynamics, and particularly under Kissinger, right? Who had a deeply transactional approach to Africa. So,
Also, by
yeah,
the way, do you ever read one of Kissinger's memoirs, the one about his time at the State Department, Years of Renewal? Because he gets into Angola and Rhodesia towards the end of
sure,
his time.
yeah,
He hated the Africa Bureau. I mean, he fired
interesting,
the assistant secretary. It was so controversial that at the Organization of African Unity, they wanted to have like a resolution calling for Kissinger to reinstate this FSO, this Foreign Service officer named Don Esom. But if you read his memoirs, he's pretty biting. He's pretty dismissive of the Africa Bureau. It's fascinating.
that is great. I know we're kind of running close to the time here, but since leaving the U.S. government, you've been affiliated with Kupanda Capital. And our listeners may remember that one of our pre-podcast guests on our webinars was Bobby Pittman, one of Kupanda's founders. We've talked a lot about what Kupanda has been doing with Afrobeats music, but give us a broader sense of what Kupanda is doing, but also what you're doing, because you've just launched a Substack, about a month or two ago, which of course I love reading, but give us a sense of what your post-US government life is like.
Yeah, I'm so honored to be working with Bobby and Linda and Queen, who are the founding partners of Kupanda. I mean, they have this track record of building businesses in Africa that have succeeded, including Maven Records. One of our newest ventures, our newest build, is in the agriculture sector. We're headquartered in Rwanda. It's a company called Oath Africa. In fact, I wrote an op-ed in the Rwanda New Times about it. And we have a nature-based solution to rejuvenate soil. Much of the soil in Africa has been degraded by the use of chemical fertilizers,
Right.
and that may have a short-term benefit in terms of agricultural yield, but it's a long-term downward trajectory in terms of its fertility. And by using a consortium of different microbes, nature-based microbes, you can rejuvenate the soil. And so that's what we're doing, and it's increasing the yield, better water retention, better soil health, greater nutrient density for the farmers and the commercial farms and the forestries that we're working with in Rwanda. So it's really rewarding and very exciting work. So that's what is a big focus right now for Kupanda. And then on the Substack, I said this to you before we went on, Todd. I have to write. I love to write. That's how I think. I had this experience in the White House, and I wanted to reflect on it. What do I think about what we're doing? What could I have done better? What could we have done better? And so the Substack, which I publish every 2 weeks, is really not what should we be doing in South Africa or Kenya, but looking at statecraft and stagecraft. So strategies. The first job I had in the Biden administration was running the Africa strategy, like what worked, what didn't work.
Right.
Looking at how we engage, the use of the Oval Office. I went through every single Oval Office between a U.S. president, starting with Kennedy, all the way up to Trump and Biden, and made a calculation on what a percentage of time that they spent with Africans
Right.
as as a whole, and then related to their other foreign leaders. We just did a piece on envoys. I have a piece on foreign assistants coming out in a couple of days, and it's great. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to learn by thinking out loud, and the feedback has been really rewarding. So that's something fun too.
It's great that you found Substack, and I'll put a link to your Substack page in the show notes. So that's a great way to lead into our last question. And I know your nightstand is probably groaning with books about the continent, but I always ask our guests to recommend 1 to 2 books that will help us better understand their focus area. For somebody maybe who's new to Africa, or somebody who is looking for something new on Africa, because there's always good literature, nonfiction coming out. But what are 1 to 2 books that you think should be on our nightstand to help us understand Africa in 2025?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit because if I'm sure you're getting the sense now of how much I love to sort of go back into the history books and try
Sure.
to understand policy. And what's the Faulkner quote? The past is never dead. It's not even past. So I continue to go back to 2 books that I think tell you a lot about how Africa policy was once done and how you do big things and challenging things and controversial things. Fortunately, they're not uh, inexpensive, and they're some of them are not. You've got to go to a used bookseller, but I'm just going to say them because they're literally my 2 favorite
Please
books.
do.
One is Chet Crocker's High Noon in Southern
I knew
Africa.
you were going to say it. It's a
Yeah.
great book. Yeah.
So Chet Crocker was President Reagan's Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, very controversial for his Southern Africa policy on constructive engagement, but I think unquestionably successful in his work to get the Cubans out of Angola, which led to Namibian independence, what was called
Right.
linkage. So it's all about, he spent 8 years. I think about criticisms for not getting a deal done in Congo, and Chet spent 8 years, and then the Bush team actually was the one who got it over the finish line
Right.
to do
And
that.
8 years of really gritty negotiations.
Gritty negotiations all over the world with Russians, with Cubans, with Angolans, with the Zambians. I mean, it's incredible. It really is a book that's a how-to for diplomacy. The second book that I love and read all the time is more academic. It's by Philip Muchenberg and Muchenbeck, and it's called Betting on the Africans, and it's about the Kennedy foreign policy. And
Fantastic.
I read that book, and it totally changed the way I think about engagement. The bureaucracy told Kennedy, listen, you need to spend your time on our allies on the continent. So spend your time with Houphouët-Boigny and spend your time with Tubman of Liberia. And he said, no, actually, the most important people I need to engage with are the ones I disagree with or we disagree with. I'm going to invest a lot of time in Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and push through the Volta Dam project. I'm going to spend a lot of time with Sekou Touré of Guinea, which ended up helping and preventing um, the Soviets from refueling in Conakry on their way to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He just had this approach of the power of the presidency and the power of personal relationships and the centrality of Africa in the challenges of that day. And it remains an inspiration to me. So those are my 2 books.
Muhlenberg, right? Or
Yeah,
Muhlenberg? Yeah. I'll definitely track it down.
great.
That's another one that I've got to add. So, well, Judd, thank you very much, my friend.
No problem.
This is what a great conversation, and I hope this could be the first of multiple because I think there will always be a new iteration of discussing Africa. So, I'd love to have you on a regular basis.
It'd be my pleasure. Thanks, Todd. This is great.